Hello and welcome to Differential Discussions. I'm Melissa,
And I'm Dave.
and we're back with another one of our guest series where we have Lacy joining us to talk about working in clinical trials. So welcome, Allie.
Hi guys, thank you.
So we're excited to have you here. Allie is, I think, the first person we have on that's not an alumni of ours for my
I know,
former
right?
Yeah,
I think she's working in the clinical lab together. She's one of us
She's
still.
a colleague.
yeah,
Yeah.
She's a colleague.
And what remind me, is it UConn? I think you're still in New York,
yes,
right?
yep.
All right.
Yeah, March Madness. Come on, let's go. Thursday.
Yeah, this is good timing. Yeah, so
Oh
we're
yeah,
recording
yeah,
during March Madness.
yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah, super excited to have you here.
Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, Allie, would you mind maybe telling us a little bit about, how you found yourself in a clinical lab and your education and then getting into doing clinical trials and things like that?
Yeah, sure. So, as mentioned, I'm a UConn alum. So originally I'd gotten my bachelor's in molecular and cell biology there. Unfortunately, the economy at the time wasn't great for research, so I kind of milled around for a couple of years. Actually went back and joined the MLS program, which, at the time was pretty small and our class was small. So it was pretty great to kind of be in that small learning environment. And, from there, I kind of got in as a lab assistant while in school. And I think that's really great because, it kind of gets your foot in the door. And if it's the same, company or department you want to work in, it's really easy once you graduate to kind of just move in full time. And also first shift, which is for some people the goal, unless you like third shift, which did not work for me. But anyway, yeah, so from there I was in the microbiology department. And because it's pretty easy to find jobs in different labs, I moved to Boston because that's really where I wanted to be from Connecticut. And so I got into hematology and started also learning flow cytometry at the time, which I really loved. So having a little bit of that specialty area was really fun. So I was at BMC for a little while, and then I tried a PhD program, thinking I kind of wanted to be in research. I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. So after a few months, I actually decided, mouse models weren't for me. I wanted to work in human trials. So that's when I moved back to Boston. I got my old job back and actually ended up moving over to Tufts so I could work in a program at the same time. It was just more flexible there. So the program I actually did was clinical investigation, and that was really learning all the ins and outs of clinical trial management, kind of the regulatory aspects with the FDA and all the things you kind of need to know there. So from there, I then moved to MGH. So I kind of, did the rounds in Boston at all the different hospitals, which was really great. I got to work with different teams. The last one was actually the cancer center. So I was able to work in the stem cell therapy department with, the apheresis nurses, also on the floor doing bedside infusions, which was really great because you got to, see patients, interact with them. We also had some clinical trials going on, through our lab, which was really great to see just with, my degree I was earning at the time. So then from there, I graduated. I joined a small company. Their name was AOBiome, and really just started out as a clinical trial associate, so essentially an entry level from there. Being a small company, I got to essentially work on anything I wanted. They were really great about kind of expanding your knowledge base and letting you work on things really regardless of your title. So I felt like I learned a lot there. But I really wanted to work in stem cell therapy, so I kind of jumped around to a couple of companies that allowed me to do that. So yeah, at this point, I've had, quite a few years of experience in pharma, and I've moved into consulting as of this week, which is kind of my end goal. So that gives me, essentially that flexibility back from, working in the lab where you could kind of, determine your schedule, do double shifts and take a long weekend, things like that. So I'm kind of back, to where I started in terms of having that flexibility, which is really great.
Awesome, thank you. And so you've told us that you've gotten to do a lot in clinical trials, but what do you
Hmm.
do in
Yeah,
clinical?
good question. Yes. So right now I'm a clinical trial manager. It's essentially what it sounds like. I manage a lot of different aspects of the trial. So, as we know, there's a lot of different phases. Phase one is, that first part of the trial where you're really just looking at safety. So, working in a phase one, you're essentially, assisting the medical team, research team, and trying to get a protocol together. You're really coordinating, with all the different departments, regulatory. A lot of times we'll actually contract out a lot of the work if you're in, a smaller company and your team is 4 or 5 people. So I'm also kind of that manager in terms of managing those contractors. So whatever work we're kind of relaying out to them, making sure our timelines are being met, the budgets, in alignment with what we're looking for, and also just meeting, corporate goals at the same time. The hot topic is always enrollment. So, as a manager, you kind of need to have that match with your timelines, but also understand some of the challenges and realities. Like with COVID, there's a lot going on there. So just trying to manage, that in terms of getting these sites what they need, in terms of, resources and things like that. A lot of these sites are institutions, different hospitals, but they can also be, outpatient centers and actual, physicians' offices. So really just kind of being that middleman between, where the research is being conducted and who's, consulting with us, and then also our team, within the company, in terms of making sure we're aligning everything. A lot of organizing, a lot
Yeah,
of communication.
yeah, kind of like a project manager sort. I like kind of sort of.
Essentially, yeah. So
Yeah.
I work with a lot of PMs, and essentially give them our timelines and kind of some of the information they need to really scope out, where the trial is going. And also, a lot of times we're working with leadership too, and looking at, other programs that we're going to be starting, and if that's doable with, kind of what's going on, currently.
A lot of juggling.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of emails.
Do you work with like a physician's running? Is the physician in charge of a clinical trial, or are you working for a company getting physicians to actually do the clinical trials? How does that part work?
Yes. So essentially, when a trial is starting, we first do site feasibility. So a lot of this is reaching out to different institutions, small, large. It really just depends on what the trial is. And so with that, we're actually speaking with, on-site coordinators as well as the physicians, and kind of just testing the waters, seeing, is this a trial you're interested in? And, if so, that's when we start moving forward, and the PI reads our protocol. They make comments and let us know, like, if there's anything we need to change and things like that. So they do give input, and, they do let us know the reality of trying to enroll patients to meet, our requirements. But essentially, the company, is kind of driving the study forward.
And when
Yeah,
you say PI, you mean the primary investigator, right?
Yes. Yep. Physician.
those jargon that.
Yeah, there's a lot, and every company has different ones too, so it's even more confusing.
So yeah, you alluded to like enrolling patients to be like a big struggle and a big part of the challenge there. So how do
Yes.
you even go about finding patients? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways, and it really just depends on your trial. So I guess I can use oncology as an example, because that's probably, it's a hot topic these days. So what you really want to do is look for institutions that, say you're working for a company that's doing an AML study. You want to look for institutions where, a lot of patients have AML. It could be that they're being drawn there because of the care, specific physicians, really just different aspects. So a lot of times we'll actually get, a list of these sites from, our contractors that we're working with, or it could be through, our medical liaisons within our company. That's, one of the positions where they make a lot of connections with different physicians, really help us get those different relationships in place. So once we can kind of flesh out if, a certain institution has the population that we need, that's when we can, push forward with the trial. Once it's active, it's a different story. There's a lot of trials going on. So some institutions actually triage their patients, which means, they'll kind of dole out depending on, the study and the order that they have designed at the institution. And there's a lot of different aspects. A lot of the times we'll actually provide transportation in order to kind of get care to patients that may not be able to travel themselves. So we try and find different ways to really outreach to, different areas as well.
Interesting. So you had mentioned that you're starting to do consulting, which sounds kind of exciting. So are you kind of working for yourself a bit there? Is that the idea?
Essentially, that's the long-term goal. I've actually found a firm that's female owned in Boston, which was really important to me. And so I'm starting there. They have a lot of clients, so I think that would be a good place to start. And then, as you build a reputation, and you can just kind of go from there. So I think stem cell therapy right now is pretty important. So there's a lot of trials out there, and I think that experience is really something people are looking for. So exciting.
That is exciting. Would you say, so in terms of the companies you've worked for, you had mentioned a startup, right? So I presume kind of a smaller company. You've kind of seen small, medium, large, sort of, or? Mostly
small, actually. I think my largest company was about 150. My first company was about 13 people. So my department was 3 people. So you can imagine, just how much work there is with just a small team of people. But it was great because they did design the company in a way where everyone had a very similar working style, but were very different. So it was very interesting to kind of move into that. It's very different from the lab, definitely. But, I think having worked in a smaller, situation like that, moving into a company that's, 120, 150, they're still relatively small, especially if you're talking about, the Pfizers of the world where, you have like probably an SOP for all the SOPs. Whereas, you may not have more than 10 SOPs at a smaller company. So very different.
Smaller companies, you got to wear more hats though, right? So it probably kind of, you grew up as a, as faster. Yeah.
You're just thrown into the fire essentially. And then you just, you can't be afraid to ask questions. And, I am someone who needs a lot to do. Otherwise, I get bored, honestly. So that's really great for me. And I think it's important to just learn as much as possible, especially kind of in my field. You do need to know a little bit of what everyone is doing so that you know who to go to for questions, who's responsible for what. And when you're kind of designing a study timeline, you need to know how long things might take. So having worked in the lab, that validating an instrument isn't, a couple of days. So when someone approaches you about, like, oh, we want this testing done, next week, you can be like, well, that's not, possible. So having that kind of background is super helpful too.
So just can you talk to us about working at a startup? What's that like as a former laboratorian now working at a startup? How is that?
It was completely different. I just absolutely loved it. I think one of the biggest things for me is, when you're working in the lab, you're working for a hospital typically. And so just kind of how things are set up in terms of like the company matrix versus like, some of the politics within a hospital system, it's very different. So when you're working in a startup, you're working with a few other people and deciding things as you go. So it's really just what works best for everybody. And in that, kind of environment, your opinion is just really, really valued. And so, I really felt like that moving into a startup, whereas in a lab, you have all these SOPs, procedures, even if you think something could be done a little bit more efficiently, in order to get it to that point, you have to go through a lot, as you guys know. So it was just really amazing to kind of go in and just things just turn on a dime, and, it's just really great.
Much more agile.
Yes, exactly.
It's like it's faster, but you probably break stuff more often. But breaking stuff is kind of fun too, right? So
Then you learn a different way to fix it, and
yeah.
you're good to go.
So I actually had a question about flow, because I know you worked like with flow for a really long time. Has
Mhm.
that skill set and that base theory been beneficial to your roles going forward past the
Oh
lab?
yeah, definitely. So part of my job too is, when you're doing research on patients, you also need to test safety. So having understanding of all of those safety labs and what they mean is really important, because as we know, not to knock physicians, but sometimes they need help with deciding which tests make the most sense. And so part of my job is to kind of contract that out to different, larger labs, and kind of design what that lab manual looks like for the study. So, working in cellular therapy, there's obviously going to be a lot of flow tests, especially when you're genetically modifying these cells. So these are being sent off. You need to understand, you know, um, how to ship them, when the testing will be done, how long it's going to take, and what that actually means. I mean, I've gotten down to the nitty gritty with, the research team, and talking about like the different panels they're using, and they need to validate certain things and stuff like that as well. So it's definitely helped a lot, I think, just having that. And research appreciates it when how much work actually goes into this too, because they're doing things behind the scenes, and you know just letting them know, like, I understand how much work this is really helpful for them too.
Bit of perspective, right?
Yeah, it's always good to appreciate those things, because everyone's always doing a lot of work.
Yeah. When you were talking about your role now in the management, and you mentioned phase one, is your role different in each phase of the clinical trial, or is it basically the same?
It's basically the same. It's just there's differences between the phases. So phase one is really kind of that initial study where a lot of the details are super important, because it's the first time it's being, you know, given to humans. So you really want to make sure those details are down. So, but yeah, as you move forward, it's just the studies are larger, so it tends to be more work. I mean, you can go into phase 2 and 3, and there might be, two clinical trial managers, depending on if it's global. If you have, 100 sites, it's just a lot to manage. So yeah, it's essentially the same role. It's just you take on a few additional tasks usually.
And what's the difference in the job description or the role between being an initial clinical trials associate versus a clinical trials manager?
So an associate, you're really essentially acting as a coordinator in terms of, um, the paperwork, doing some of the documentation review. You're kind of the note taker. You're making sure that the timelines are updated, enrollment's updated. Really, any little tasks that need to be done. There's also something called user testing, which is when we design specific EDC systems, which essentially electronically track all of the data that you need for your trial. So that's something a CTA might do, where, they go in and test to make sure that everything looks okay. They still need to know, the details of the protocol and things like that. And they're really just there to support.
But they're not
Sometimes they'll also work with the sites as well.
but they're not helping design everything like you are now.
I mean, it depends. If you're in a smaller company, I had a lot of, input on things, just being like a fresh pair of eyes. And I think that's a really good environment. But the manager would be the one to kind of initiate some of those changes for sure.
Interesting.
So as far as education, you started with like hard science and then that kind of changed, right, with your graduate studies. But
Mhm.
how much has that MLS and even your degree before that kind of fed into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously having that background on diagnostics is really important.
Hmm.
But it also teaches you how to be really organized, because when you're in, school for a field like that, there's a lot to know. So I think it really helps with that. I think having, doing rounds and kind of meeting different people when you're rotating through the labs, and as well as, some of your classmates you're working with, it really helps you kind of find your way of communicating,
Hmm.
which is really important in my job. I think you need to be able to understand different personalities really well and be able to communicate clearly. So I think that was really helpful. Yeah, and just being disciplined. I mean, in the science fields, you're kind of on your own. So you really need to be disciplined and be kind of, a go-getter. And I think it really helped me. I know when students do rotations, it's usually the ones that are really on top of things and asking questions that typically get hired. So that's really kind of where you want to be.
And can you talk a little bit more about the PhD research program that you went into and why you didn't? I know you said you didn't like mouse models, but
Yeah.
what else can you talk to us about that transition?
Yeah. So, I mean, my end goal from that is that I really wanted to be involved in research. Having worked in flow, you're diagnosing these patients with a disease that, could be terminal. And I really wanted to be on the other end, working on, possible treatments or cures for things like that. And so that's what prompted me to enter the PhD. Once I was in there, I realized, it is super focused. So you're really super, super focused on, one specific thing. And I could not kill a mouse to save my life. I had to have someone else do it for me the like 3 times that it happened. And I was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I can't. And the sheer politics as well. It came to be less of, science and driven towards, my goals of working in research, and more towards, well, you need to be in a certain grade point, or be doing a certain rotation in a certain lab, to kind of impress someone. um, but I ended up meeting a physician who was doing pediatric oncology studies, and he was working in the lab with me, and I was just talking to him about it, and I realized that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in clinical trials and kind of surpass that preclinical work where they're typically working in mouse models. And I just happened to see this program at BU that fit perfectly. So that's kind of where it went. I was there for about 9 months, so I didn't last too long, but
Well,
it was enough.
it's tough. I think we all have kind of dreams, and when you're looking towards like research and the idea of curing diseases and things like that, we see why people might be attracted to that. But the nuances of how you get there,
Yeah,
there's like nothing in high school or even your undergrad, really, right? To kind of tell you what
no,
path is going to get you to the place that you actually want to be, right? Because to say,
yeah,
research, at least when I look at that, that's like a huge umbrella.
yeah, it's
Um,
massive.
so like, you know, how does someone decide, right? How do you help someone who's younger, who's maybe looking to break into the field, kind of help differentiate? Do they want to be in that pre-trial phase, the nitty-gritty research, or do they want to? How do you figure that out?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I just did it.
Yep. That's the answer I
So
was afraid you
yeah,
were going to
I
say,
mean,
right? But that's
I was never really afraid to kind of just jump in and say, this sounds like something that works for me. And the thing about the MLS program is that it gave me that confidence because, you know, you're working in the lab, you're in a high stress environment. Like these are patients. So when you then go back to academia and you're working in there, it's a little different. The stress is a little different. So I felt like, yeah, it was just a different way to cope there, I guess. But I think, you know, to make a good decision, if you don't want to just jump into things, and see if it works for you, is I would say just, you know, track down people on LinkedIn or through your network and just have coffee with them. Yep. See if, you know, what they're working on is interesting to you. I mean, there are internships. Pharma companies do a lot of internships, like an insane amount of co-ops have joined my companies previously. And, you know, sometimes they stay on and sometimes, you know, they move on to another internship. But that's also something that is really great because you see more of a snapshot of what that life would be like. Yeah, I would say just talk to people, kind of see what their path was and just get more information. Yeah, I mean, I'm always open to talk to people because I kind of went indirectly into clinical operations, but it was the right path for me, so it worked out.
Yeah, so it's kind of like discovering the foods you like. You got to kind of try
Yeah.
stuff, and some of it you might not like.
Yep.
Yeah, but I
That
can
is true.
appreciate that shadowing. And yeah, just really encourage anybody that is viewing or listening to this podcast. If you're an undergrad, just go and shadow or do internships. Find things to do. You had mentioned too that you did some interning when you were in your undergrad too, right? Was that?
I did actually. I did a couple of things in different research labs. When you're an undergrad, though, it just seems like there's not there's not as much importance. So like I don't know. There's a couple times where I would show up to the lab and it would be locked, and I'm like, it is the time I'm supposed to be here, you know? Like,
No.
so yeah, and I think that's just, you know, it depends on who you're working under as well in the lab. But
Sure.
it can be very tedious work in undergrad. So I feel like sometimes that may not relate to what it's going to be like once you graduate. They typically give you the things that are extremely repetitive and need to get done. They're important, obviously, but you know, it may feel a little less exciting.
Okay. I think that's the nitty gritty research as a whole, though. I've seen the memes where it's like, you know, what you think research is, and you see the little drawing of the scientist going, Eureka! And what it actually is you're just like, here I am doing the same
3 years of
experiment.
pipetting, and here we are.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, though, is everybody thinks research is, and then it's really that kind of,
Yeah.
no, but like, you know, it's a drag. It's a lot more work and less eurekas.
So I think the other thing too that I think about psychologically is like, obviously it's ideal when everything works the way it's supposed to and you solve world hunger, right? Fill in the blank malady plaguing the earth. But a lot of research is failure, right? I mean, not to, so psychologically, I'm sure you probably had to cope with different setbacks and there's probably degrees.
Oh yeah, it's the same, you know, when you're thinking of bench science research and clinical operations. You know, it's kind of a different route, right? Like I am dealing a lot more with, you know, people, but you know, there are challenges. When COVID hit, patients weren't going to visits, they weren't going to sites, they weren't traveling. So we weren't even able to get data, which, as you know, it's expensive running a trial. So not having that is extremely difficult. But yeah, I mean, a lot of studies end in failure, whether it's, you know, big pharma or startup company. It is really difficult. And even when you do have a positive outcome, you know, it's not the cure to end everything. This is, you know, it's looking positive and moving forward, we can make improvements. So
this
yeah,
might
I
work as
mean,
good news sometimes.
yeah, or it works as good as, you know, the gold standard. And that's really what we look to in the beginning, because research is slow, whether it's, you know, a bench scientist working on a project or, you know, a new small molecule drug in a patient, it does take years. So I think the average now is, I think it's still around 9 years, 10 years
In clinical
to get a drug.
trials?
I think
Or
so. Yeah, I know things changed a bit with COVID just because the FDA had to kind of speed things up, but depending on, the company, it does take a long time. So
if it would take 9 years for one drug to move all the way through clinical trials, are you on that same project the whole time, or how do you get a project?
yeah, I mean, not necessarily. I don't I don't know too many people that are in the same role for that long, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, if something's moving forward that positive, you do get excited and want to see it through.
Yeah.
But at that point, it just becomes a massive study. So you typically have a lot more people working on it. But yeah, that's the dream, to see through a product that is going to be that great and that positive.
So your coworkers that are also in clinical trial associates or management positions, do any of them have MLS backgrounds?
I don't think so. Um,
What sort of
I
backgrounds?
want to say, yeah, I want to say that I've had a few people I worked with that were actually originally nurses. And then they became like clinical coordinators, coordinating the studies on site, which, is what a lot of the coordinators are. Um, but yeah, I don't think I've met too many other people with my background, to be honest. I mean, I've had colleagues that, worked in research shortly or, things like that. But yeah, I seem to be the only one that I know of right now.
I imagine like a lot of chemists maybe, or I don't know.
I would think a lot of do you have a lot of people with like more of the management background in your role?
Yeah, I keep kind of misplacing my thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, that's because I'm all over the place with my career history, Dave. So
You're just
don't
so
feel too bad.
talented. Yeah, you just have all this. So, I mean, honestly, if we can gather anything from here, your education is truly multidisciplinary, right? So your educational background, and then you have the clinical background, and you get that taste of the research. So you've done it all in a short amount of time, sort of.
Yeah,
You
I'm
touched a lot of these
exhausted. No, I'm
different
just,
pieces.
I'm just Yeah, no, I mean, it's great. A site asked me a question about like reporting out a flow result, and I was like, oh yeah, can you just like re-edit and give me the numbers because I know you can do that. And they're like, well, yeah, it just takes a lot of time and it's
You're like,
difficult for
who
us
are
to
you?
do that. Yeah, I'm like, yeah, I'm just calling them up like, excuse me. I know what you're capable of. I've done it. Can't tell me no.
This is just maybe a silly question, but how big have you found the community to be in the Boston area, the greater Boston area, New England, in terms of the clinical trials research?
It's massive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is so massive. I mean, there's just hundreds of jobs, and Boston is kind of like the epicenter. It seems lately, but a lot of people are moving to remote just because they're trying to find talent in different places. Which in my career is pretty important because you're working with a lot of people that are also remote or in different states. So yeah, I mean, if you're in Boston, you're good to go. There's just more companies than I can count, really.
So are you working remotely
Mm-hmm. Yes.
always or sometimes?
Yes.
Always.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you can choose not to be fully remote. It's really just, who you're working with and kind of what their expectations are. So for me, it works.
It
For some
seems like
people,
a
it doesn't.
positive business decision too. I mean, when you're talking about trying to find the best talent, like and geography truly doesn't contribute one way or the other, then why not, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you're looking for someone to actually go and visit your sites and, you're a West Coast company and you might hire someone on the East Coast to, go to your East Coast sites, but
yeah.
Yeah, pretty flexible.
I just had a question that escaped my mind. Yeah, that's what it did.
That happens to me all the time. I always have thoughts just fall out of my ears. It's just, oh well. But yeah, yeah, it's really neat to get your perspective. I just have so many students that are like so hyped for anything to do with research, anything even tangentially like related to it.
Yeah, I mean, you can go in so many different directions too. Like, you know, some of these companies have huge research departments, but you can work in that. And if you find that, you know, you like working with people more and you want to have a different kind of schedule, you know, I work with translational research, which are the people that are, you know, taking the data and, you know, putting it into plots or, you know, redesigning slides or submitting it to different meetings and conferences and like talking to it essentially to get results out there. And, you know, they're designing, you know, different testing panels and things like that without actually being bench scientists. So there's also that if you're more into, you know, kind of coordinating those things as well.
It takes a lot of different skill sets to make this stuff work. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's behind the scenes, there's a lot going on for sure. And then you have to add in the FDA on top of everything. So, yep.
That's almost its own podcast, is regulatory stuff. And
yeah. We typically have a regulatory person, so I always confirm everything because there's just so much and it changes.
I remembered my question. So my question was, so you have a master's. Do all of your colleagues have the similar masters? What is the education that's typically needed to go into clinical trials, associates, or management?
Yeah, I think I would say most of my colleagues, you know, on my level or above have masters. I think it's just, you know, depending on what you're doing within clinical operations, what the master's is. But I don't think it needs to be specific to management necessarily. I think that some of the skills you need are really just things you would learn in life, just being highly organized and being able to communicate well. I mean, it always helps to have something to that nature, obviously in a degree form, but yeah, I mean, I think it really just depends.
So if someone was interested in starting in clinical trials, would the clinical trial associate be that first position that they would start applying to?
I would say so. Yep. Yeah.
And would they just need their bachelor's for that, or would they need their master's to start applying?
You don't need your master's for that. Yeah.
You just gave a lot of people hope.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's good to have a little bit of background because there is a lot, but you know, if a company is willing to take you on and train you, that is the way to go. Because you're putting things, you know, to use before being in a program. So for me, I was learning everything, and obviously I had to do, you know, a thesis at the end, but I wasn't learning as I was. I mean, I wasn't, you know, working as I was learning it. So it was really, the thesis was really helpful because, you know, I wanted to apply everything. So I think for people wondering, you know, if they wanted to look at CTA positions and then decide and get into a master's program, that would probably be a good way to start. Definitely. Because I just jumped into the program not having a clue. You know, per my usual, I just jumped right in. I was like, oh, I don't know what any of this is.
It keeps
IRB,
working.
I don't know what an IRB is, so let's find out.
Yeah, well, it seems to be a successful way to go about things. Yeah, I think you can't be, you know, we should all live life a little bit dangerous, right? Don't be too conservative.
Of course, yeah.
I think one of the other things too, I've reiterated several times, is if you do have this MLS kind of background, the hospitals aren't going anywhere. Clinical laboratories aren't going anywhere. So it does help when you have a fallback plan to be a little bit, it's easier to be a little more adventurous, perhaps. But
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and if you like traveling, that's definitely the way to go because you can find jobs in different places, or you can just, take the time yourself and just work a bunch of double shifts and, go to school at the same time, whatever you want to do. It's great.
easy peasy.
Yeah. Until a physician calls up angry and then you have to deal with them at, 4 a.m. But you
No
get used
advice
to
for
it.
that, though.
Yeah.
So, Allie, two more questions. Well, one is, how is your work-life balance working in clinical trials management versus what it was in the hospital setting?
It's completely different in every aspect, I would say. So working in the lab, I mean, it can be flexible, right? You do typically work holidays, weekends. You can work all different shifts. Some places make you rotate through shifts. And the thing about that is you clock out, right? And you're done, unless you're in flow and you're on call or, something like that, which is possible. But once you leave work, you're leaving work behind,
Yeah.
right? And so that's very different from working in clinical operations where your email is on 24/7. So you are always technically working. But, on slower times, slower days, you can especially if you're working remotely, you can go do errands, right? You can kind of tailor some things on your schedule, but it's always with you. And so if you don't like that, I definitely wouldn't recommend it. But I like it. I like to be able to address things quickly and check my email and make sure everything's going well at all times. And then you just have to kind of be disciplined and, certain times just turn it off and say like, I'm done. You might work some weekends, but it's typically on your own time, so your schedule's a little bit better. I would say though, when you're first starting out in clinical operations, it's a lot. You're not working 40 hours a week, it's more like 60, maybe a little bit more. So there are long days, long weeks, but it does pay off. And then in the end, you might have summer Fridays off and things like that, where they're really trying to help balance as a company. But yeah, I think going into consulting is the ultimate with flexibility because you're still kind of determining your own schedule. Again, you're always on for whatever they need, but I kind of like that schedule myself, so I think it works out.
I think you hit the key part though, is to knowing when to unplug or when to kind of tap out. And,
yeah, it's a learned skill. It's actually much harder for me to do as my personality, but I found that going to a yoga or workout class, like I am literally unavailable for an hour. So, that kind of thing's really helpful.
And exercise is really good for stress management, right?
Yeah, it is.
Critical.
Exactly. I actually had a colleague that put it on her calendar and was like, twice a week from 5 to 6, I am taking, Pilates. Do not bother me because I won't answer. And I thought that was amazing that she kind of set that tone. And it just made the working environment really great, just knowing that that is something that's valued for sure.
All right. And our last question is, if someone's trying to get into clinical trials, associate, what is the best piece of advice, the one thing you would tell them?
That's a really good question. There's so many things. Yeah, I would say just be flexible. Just really be flexible with your expectations and what you want to work on. Because I think there's going to be a lot of different things, and yeah, I guess just be ready to work and learn. That's all I can really say, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think you've given some really good advice throughout this whole time too. So just kind of summarizing it and say yes, do the work. That's a good piece of advice.
I think do the work is an important component too. I think maybe some people take for granted how much you really might need to grind in the beginning.
Oh yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot.
And
You're
to
usually the first one there and the last one to leave. But it's not always going to be like that. So
but it gets more glamorous, right?
it does. You'll get some swag and, you know, all that jazz. You'll get some stuff. It pays out in the end. It's really great. And then, you know, you're working towards something that's really exciting, and, you know, a lot of the times it's first in human, you know. So that's pretty crazy. I mean,
That is
even it
crazy.
doesn't matter what role you're in, you're still working towards the same goal as everyone. So um I think it's pretty amazing.
Keeps you focused too, keeping that in mind, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Well,
Well,
Allie, thank you so much for coming and spending the time with us and sharing your profession with us and all of our listeners.
yeah, we
Thank
really
you
appreciate
guys.
it.
Yeah, this was great. I could talk for hours about it. So,
Yay! Well,
feel
maybe
free
we'll
to
have you
send
back.
people my way if they have any questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that leads in. I mean, so for those that enjoyed the podcast, please do send us an email. Check us out on social media. We love to get suggestions too. So if there's anything that you'd like to see us kind of address, Melissa and I can explore our network and maybe find someone that does that job or talk about a particular topic. And if you have any questions for Allie, you can kind of forward them through us and we can hook up with Allie and get that addressed. But yeah, it was a blast. Again, thanks, Allie.
Thank you guys.
Please subscribe and thanks for listening.
Thanks for your time.